At 6:27 in the morning, in a quiet Bay Area valley most people have never heard of, the ground started moving. Not once, 33 separate times in under 90 minutes, strong enough in places to knock items clean off store shelves. That was February 2nd, 2026 in San Ramon, California. And it wasn't an isolated event. Within the same handful of months, seismologists were independently tracking unusual clusters of earthquakes rattling a Utah desert town near an ancient volcanic field, a stretch of empty Nevada wilderness northeast of Tonopah, a geothermal field north of San Francisco, and a swarm so intense in California's Imperial Valley that it produced over 400 tremors in a single weekend. Different states, different fault systems, different underlying causes, all happening within the same rough window of time, across a country that most people assume only really shakes in California. This is what scientists actually found, what's driving each of these separate events, and why the pattern itself, even without any single catastrophic quake, is genuinely worth understanding. Stick with me on this one, because by the time we get through all four of these locations, you're going to have a genuinely different picture of where in this country the ground is actually moving than whatever picture you walked in with. Drop a comment and tell me if you've ever actually felt an earthquake swarm yourself versus a single sudden quake, because the experience of living through one is genuinely different. And I want to hear how it compared. And if you want to keep tracking unusual seismic activity like this as it gets reported, subscribe now, because this year has produced an unusually steady stream of these stories. Let's start with the term that ties all of these events together, because understanding it is the key to understanding everything else in this story. Scientists call this specific pattern of activity an earthquake swarm, and it behaves in a way that's fundamentally different from the kind of earthquake sequence most people picture in their heads. When most people imagine an earthquake, they picture a single, sudden, powerful main shock, followed by a gradually fading tail of smaller aftershocks that taper off over the following days, weeks, or months, each one typically about a full magnitude unit weaker than the one before it. The predictable pattern is exactly how the vast majority of earthquake sequences actually behave. A swarm breaks that rule entirely. According to the U.S. Geological Survey's own definition, a swarm consists of relatively many earthquakes happening within a relatively small area, but without a single dominant event driving the sequence. Sometimes the biggest quake in a swarm lands in the middle of the sequence rather than kicking it off. Sometimes activity holds steady, or even increases, for weeks rather than tapering off the way a normal aftershock sequence does. It's a fundamentally different kind of seismic behavior, and the fact that scientists were tracking it independently across so many different parts of the country within such a compressed window is exactly what makes this story worth digging into. It's worth understanding exactly why scientists bother drawing this distinction so carefully, because it isn't just academic terminology. The pattern a sequence follows over time is genuinely one of the most useful tools seismologists have for anticipating what a given cluster of earthquakes is likely to do next. A classic main shock aftershock sequence follows decades of well-established statistical relationships, allowing scientists to issue meaningful, probability-based forecasts for how likely additional aftershocks of a given size are within the days following a main event. A swarm doesn't follow that same predictable decay curve, which means forecasting exactly how long a given swarm will continue, or whether its largest event has already happened or is still ahead, is considerably harder. That's part of why seismologists monitoring a swarm in real time tend to speak carefully in probabilities and general historical comparisons, rather than offering the kind of confident, specific predictions people often want to hear once the ground starts shaking repeatedly in their community. Let's go state by state, because each of these swarms turned out to have its own distinct cause, and seeing them side by side is genuinely one of the more revealing ways to understand just how many different mechanisms can actually produce the same basic phenomenon, unusual, clustered earthquake activity, in wildly different geological settings. Start with San Ramon, California, the swarm that kicked off this entire stretch of unusual activity. Between 6:27 and 8 Alaska that February morning, the U.S. Geological Survey recorded no fewer than 33 separate earthquakes shaking the San Ramon Valley, 28 miles east of San Francisco, ranging in strength from magnitude 1, 3, up to magnitude 4. 2. Here's what makes San Ramon such a genuinely interesting case study for understanding swarms generally. According to USGS scientists studying the region, there's no active volcano anywhere near San Ramon. The closest volcanic rocks in the area are somewhere between 5 and 8 million years old and, in the USGS's own words, very cold and dead. That detail matters enormously because it rules out one of the two major categories scientists use to classify swarms. This wasn't magma or hydrothermal fluid moving beneath the surface. It was a purely tectonic swarm, driven by stress redistributing through the crust along existing faults, rather than by any kind of underground fluid or molten rock activity. And crucially, USGS researchers noted that San Ramon has a long, well-documented history of exactly this kind of swarm activity, with similar sequences recorded in 2018, 2015, 2003, 2002, 1990, 1976, and all the way back to 1970. Swarms, the USGS emphasizes, are actually relatively rare across California as a whole, even though the state is famously riddled with tectonic faults. The right conditions for a fault to reliably produce a swarm rather than a normal main shock-aftershock sequence are confined to a handful of specific locations, and those locations tend to have a long repeating history of swarms, which is exactly the pattern San Ramon fits. If you found the San Ramon story surprising, that a stretch of the Bay Area has been quietly producing repeat swarms since 1970 without most people outside the immediate area ever hearing about it, a like on this video genuinely helps more people see just how much routine seismic activity happens well outside the handful of famous fault lines most of us can actually name. Now travel roughly 400 miles northeast into the high desert of central Nevada, where an entirely different kind of swarm was unfolding around the exact same time. Beginning in late February 2026 and continuing into March, a sequence of earthquakes shook the desert northeast of Tonopah in Nye County, eventually totaling nearly 100 separate events, most falling between magnitude 1, 5, and 3, 0, with a few climbing above 3, 5, the largest single event registered at magnitude, 4, 3, producing light shaking across Tonopah and nearby desert communities, but no reported structural damage or injuries. Local seismologists studying the sequence described it as a textbook tectonic swarm, clustering along a short, previously unmapped fault segment within Nevada's Basin and Range Province, a massive region of active crustal extension that covers much of the state. Seismologists specifically noted that this pattern is far from unprecedented in the region, pointing to comparable sequences like the Monte Cristo Range magnitude 6, 5 swarm in 2020, and the Hawthorne swarm back in 2011, both confined to shallow, normal faults responding to that same ongoing regional extension. There was, predictably, a wave of online speculation linking the swarm to nearby military installations, given the area's proximity to well-known restricted facilities. Both the USGS and independent academic seismologists directly addressed and dismissed that theory, stating that the seismic waveforms, depths, and geographic pattern of the swarm were entirely consistent with a natural tectonic origin, unrelated to any military or industrial activity in the area. It's worth pausing on the Basin and Range Province itself for a moment, because it's genuinely one of the more remarkable, if underdiscussed, geological features in all of North America, and understanding it explains why both the Nevada and Utah swarms in this story trace back to fundamentally the same broad tectonic process, even though their immediate triggers were different. The Basin and Range Province covers a massive stretch of the western United States, spanning most of Nevada and extending into Utah, Arizona, and beyond, characterized by a distinctive pattern of north-south mountain ranges, separated by flat, sediment-filled valleys, or basins. That alternating landscape exists precisely because the Earth's crust across this entire region is actively stretching apart, thinning as it does, which causes blocks of crust to drop down along steep faults to form the basins, while adjacent blocks tilt upward to form the ranges. This ongoing extension has been happening for millions of years and continues today at a measurable, if slow, rate, which is exactly why this enormous swath of the country produces earthquakes and swarms on a fairly regular basis, even though it rarely gets anywhere close to the media attention California's fault systems receive. Head south and slightly east from Tonopah into central Utah, and you find a swarm with a genuinely different underlying mechanism, even though it looks superficially similar on the surface. Starting on the morning of April 19, 2026, residents in southern Millard County, Utah, began experiencing a series of small earthquakes, eventually totaling at least 32 recorded events by the following day, with the largest reaching magnitude 3. 6. The location itself turned out to matter enormously for understanding what was actually driving this particular sequence. This swarm occurred along the eastern margin of the Basin and Range Province, in a zone called the Intermountain Seismic Belt that runs down the spine of Utah, but specifically along the eastern edge of the Black Rock Desert, a region the Utah Geological Survey describes as the youngest volcanic field in the entire state. While researchers were explicit that this swarm was not evidence of an impending volcanic eruption, they also noted that the underground plumbing of that ancient volcanic system remains genuinely active, and that swarms in this specific area are frequently triggered by fluid migration, heated water or gases like carbon dioxide moving through tiny cracks deep in the crust, acting almost like a lubricant that allows small, already fractured fault segments to slip and slide against each other. Seismologists from the University of Utah seismograph stations describe these swarms as typically self-contained, usually fizzling out on their own within days, and explicitly called the Kanosh sequence, a completely normal sign of the Earth, adjusting to pressure in one of North America's most geologically active regions. There's a fourth location worth including here too, because it demonstrates yet another distinct mechanism entirely. And if you've made it this far into the video, subscribe now, because I'll keep covering stories like this as new swarms and unusual seismic patterns get documented throughout the rest of the year. In March of 2026, a swarm developed near the geysers, a major geothermal field north of San Francisco, already well known to seismologists for producing frequent low-magnitude earthquakes as a direct consequence of its underground geothermal characteristics. Following an initial magnitude 2, 4 event, a sequence of smaller tremors ranging between roughly magnitude 1, 0, and 2, 0, continued rolling through the area over the following day, with most of the activity occurring at shallow depths under 5 kilometers. The USGS specifically distinguished this pattern from a normal aftershock sequence, noting that swarms consist of multiple small tremors without one clearly dominant main event, and attributing the geysers' activity directly to the region's underlying geothermal processes rather than to any broader tectonic stress buildup. It's genuinely worth understanding why geothermal areas like the geysers behave so differently from purely tectonic locations, because the mechanism is fairly intuitive once it's laid out clearly. Geothermal fields exist precisely because hot fluid and steam are actively moving through fractured rock close to the surface, either naturally or, in the case of the geysers specifically, partly influenced by decades of commercial geothermal energy production that extracts steam to generate electricity. That constant movement of fluid and steam through underground fractures creates small, localized pressure changes that can trigger frequent, low-magnitude earthquakes almost continuously, which is exactly why the geysers region has one of the highest concentrations of recorded small earthquakes anywhere in California, even though those events rarely reach a size capable of causing any real damage. Here's the detail that ties this entire story together, and it's genuinely the most important piece of context in the whole video. 4 separate swarms in 4 separate states within roughly the same 2-month stretch, and 4 different underlying causes. San Ramon, a purely tectonic swarm along a well-documented, repeatedly active fault zone. Tonopah, another tectonic swarm, but along a previously unmapped fault responding to regional crustal stretching in the basin and range. Kanosh, a swarm driven specifically by underground fluid migration interacting with the plumbing of a dormant volcanic system. The geysers, a swarm produced by ongoing geothermal activity rather than tectonic stress at all. Scientists studying swarms generally distinguish between these categories precisely because the underlying mechanism tells you something genuinely important about what to expect next. As USGS researchers explain it, the magnitudes of swarms driven by magma or hydrothermal fluid most often don't follow a clear, predictable pattern over time, instead arriving in bursts, waves, or even a steady, rhythmic drumbeat. A pattern very different from purely tectonic swarms responding to stress, simply redistributing through existing rock. And this pattern of widespread, geographically scattered swarms wasn't limited to just these 4 locations either. Southern California's Imperial Valley saw its own dramatic swarm in May of 2026, with hundreds of earthquakes shaking Imperial County over a single weekend, including a magnitude 4. 7 tremor near the town of Brawley recorded on Mother's Day, part of a sequence that eventually totaled more than 400 individual tremors, according to the Southern California Seismic Network. Experts covering that swarm were quick to point out that despite how unsettling that sheer number of earthquakes sounds, Imperial County has a long, well-established history of exactly this kind of intense swarm activity, and the sequence was consistent with the region's known geology rather than representing something genuinely unprecedented. So here's the honest, central question this entire story raises. If each of these swarms individually has a well-understood, locally specific explanation, tectonic stress here, fluid migration there, geothermal activity somewhere else entirely, does the fact that so many happened across so many different states within such a compressed window actually mean anything at all? This is exactly the kind of question seismologists get asked constantly whenever a cluster of unrelated seismic events makes headlines together, and it's worth being genuinely honest about the answer, rather than either dismissing the pattern entirely or overstating it for dramatic effect. The scientific consensus, consistently repeated by seismologists across every single one of these individual events, is that these swarms are not physically connected to each other. California's tectonic stress along the San Ramon Fault system has no meaningful physical relationship to fluid migration beneath a dormant Utah volcanic field hundreds of miles away. And neither of those has any real connection to geothermal activity at the geysers or crustal extension in the Nevada desert. These are independent geological systems, governed by independent local conditions, and the honest, well-supported scientific position is that seeing several of them produce swarms within a similar window of time is a statistical coincidence rather than evidence of some larger connected process quietly building underneath the entire western United States. But here's why that statistical coincidence framing, while scientifically accurate, doesn't mean this pattern is nothing worth paying attention to. The United States, and particularly the entire western half of the country, sits on top of an enormous, complex patchwork of active fault systems, volcanic remnants, and geothermal fields, all of which are constantly, quietly, adjusting to accumulated stress in ways that mostly go completely unnoticed by the public. What's genuinely notable about this particular stretch of months isn't that any single one of these swarms was unusual in isolation. Each one, taken on its own, fits comfortably within decades of well-documented precedent for that specific location. What's notable is how visible the sheer diversity of active seismic processes across the country became within such a short, compressed window. Tectonic stress, fluid migration, geothermal activity, all producing headline-worthy swarms within the same rough stretch of time, across states that most people don't typically associate with meaningful earthquake risk at all. Nevada and Utah, in particular, rarely register in the public imagination as seismically significant states the way California does, and yet both produced swarms this year involving dozens to nearly 100 individual earthquakes. That last point deserves genuine emphasis, because it's arguably the most practically useful takeaway buried in this entire story. A huge percentage of the American public genuinely believes earthquake risk in this country is essentially a California-only phenomenon, something that happens along the San Andreas Fault and nowhere else worth worrying about. The swarms, tracked across this single stretch of months, tell a considerably more complicated story. Nevada's Basin and Range Province is one of the most seismically active regions in the entire continental United States, a fact that gets far less public attention than California's more famous fault systems, despite a comparable, ongoing history of significant earthquakes. Utah's Intermountain Seismic Belt runs the length of the state and has produced swarms and significant quakes for as long as scientists have been monitoring it. Even areas most people would never think to associate with earthquake risk at all have their own quiet, well-documented seismic histories that occasionally surface in exactly this kind of visible, clustered way. So what should you actually take away from all of this if you live anywhere in the broader western United States, whether that's California, Nevada, Utah, or one of the many other states with an active, if less publicized, fault system running beneath it? If you found this useful, a like on this video genuinely helps more people outside California understand that earthquake preparedness applies to them too, not just to residents living directly along the San Andreas. The most useful takeaway is not panic, and every single seismologist quoted across every one of these individual swarms was explicit and consistent about that point. These specific swarms, in isolation, were consistent with decades of well-documented precedent for their respective regions, and none of them were treated by the scientists studying them as a warning sign of an imminent, larger, unrelated catastrophe. But the broader pattern is still a genuinely useful reminder that earthquake preparedness shouldn't be something only California residents think about. If you live anywhere near the Basin and Range Province, the Intermountain Seismic Belt, or any of the many other active fault systems scattered across the western United States, having a basic earthquake preparedness plan, knowing how to secure heavy furniture, having a stocked emergency kit, understanding your specific home's structural vulnerabilities, is just as relevant to you as it is to someone living directly along the San Andreas Fault. Even if your state rarely makes national headlines for its seismic activity the way California does, here's the thought I want to leave you with. For most people, earthquakes exist as a single monolithic risk tied almost entirely to California, a place where the ground is famous for shaking and everywhere else is assumed to be geologically quiet by comparison. What this particular stretch of months actually revealed, through 4 or 5 genuinely distinct swarms happening across 4 or 5 genuinely distinct states, is a country that is quietly, constantly active beneath the surface in far more places than most people ever think to consider, driven by an entire range of different underlying mechanisms that have nothing meaningfully in common with each other beyond the simple fact that they all, eventually, make the ground move. None of these individual swarms turned out to be the harbinger of some larger catastrophe, but together they offer a genuinely useful, if quietly unsettling, reminder that the ground beneath a huge swath of this country is considerably more restless, in considerably more places than most of us ever stop to think about.